Okay. Welcome tonight to one of our PTA, Second District PTA 411 Wednesdays. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the SFUSD budget and specifically how we are prioritizing our investments. We are really glad to have a few guests with us from SFUSD tonight. My name is Michelle Parker. I'm the Vice President of Leadership for the Second District PTA. The district PTA supports all of the PTAs across SFUSD, which is about 64 schools. And I, as the leadership VP, am just responsible for helping to build leadership and capacity at our schools. And I'm really happy to be here. The guests we have with us tonight from the school district are Megan Wallace, who's our Chief Financial Officer. We have Myung Lee, who is the Deputy Superintendent, one of our Deputy Superintendents over Policy and Operations, and Anne Marie Gordon, who is the Executive Director of Budget Services. And I'm going to turn this over to them in just 1 second. I want to just let you know of a couple of 411 Wednesdays we have coming up in October. On October 20th, we are going to have a meeting about the new assignment system for SFUSD. There'll be a chance to engage around some of the detailed decisions that will have to be made over this year. And then we will also be having one about how PTAs and school site councils can work together effectively. So watch for those coming up pretty soon. And I will go ahead and turn it over to our SFUSD team. I don't know who's up first, if it's Megan or somebody else.
I'll go ahead and kick us off. Thank you, Michelle. And I just need you to stop sharing and then I'll share. There we go. Perfect. Thank you. Perfect. So good evening, everybody. Happy to be here to talk about prioritizing our investments in SFUSD. As Michelle introduced us, I'm Megan Wallace. Anne Marie Gordon will help present, and Myung Lee is here to support. But to recap, I just want to highlight that this evening is part of a series of events that are intended to inform and engage our community in conversations about SFUSD's budget. I'm very excited to have a regular group of folks who follow along and are building up their knowledge about the school district budget because we need partners in this path before us. So the first two events were in March and April of 2021, and we're trying to take gradually deeper dives as we go. So today we're going to talk about prioritization within our budget. And the key objectives that we're looking to accomplish this evening will be a quick review of the district's budget outlook. We'll review the concept of zero-based budgeting, and then we'll take some of that thinking of ZBB and applying it to school baseline funding. So to begin, I want to cover our budget outlook. There's been plenty of coverage in the news and online just about how the district is facing a significant deficit. And it's important to highlight that this has happened over time. You'll be able to see in this graph that the yellow line represents our expenditures historically, where looking back in 2018, there was an upward trend in the expenditures in our district budget, whereas the red line, which represents the revenue that we generate each year, as well as any available fund balance, the combination of those two were supporting our operating budget for a period of time. But as you can see in fiscal year 1920, or the 2020 actuals timeframe, our expenditures came severely close to meeting our available resources. And as a school district, we're just not allowed to do that. We have to maintain a balanced budget and make sure that we don't spend beyond our means. Otherwise, we risk having a takeover by the state or the California Department of Education. As you can see, midway through this graph, there's a dip where the expenditures drop down, and that's depicting the shift of expenditures onto one-time federal and state dollars that were given to our school district to help support us primarily through the COVID-19 pandemic. However, those were just one-time sources. They've been able to help us through this tumultuous time, and they have, in effect, helped address our deficit, but haven't addressed the structural issues within our budget. And just to highlight real quickly, I do want to share that many school districts struggle. The reality is that funding to school districts in California just is not enough to cover the cost of living increases, the demand for additional services for our students. That costs have just grown over time, the needs have grown over time, but the revenue trajectory just has not caught up. In addition to that, we have not necessarily controlled the growth in our costs. The fact that our expenditures were greater than the blue line, which represents the revenue that we brought in, means that we were spending on a deficit for several years. And the reality is that now's the time to fix that structural deficit. We're continuing to look at ever growing shortfalls. And really just the magnitude of this challenge requires us to be strategic and look closely at how we're going to prioritize the use of the funds that we do have. So the solution that the district has developed is following a path towards zero-based budgeting. And the primary intent or vision of zero-based budgeting is to develop and execute a fiscal year 2022-23 budget balancing plan that will preserve the fundamental functions and equitably support students and families of our district while ensuring a sustainable financial future. I really want to emphasize the fundamental functions and the equitable support. Those are critical parts of zero-based budgeting, that we're looking closely at our expenses and making sure that we're providing those core needs and having an equitable distribution of resources. But the time frame is extremely narrow. We actually are required by the California Department of Education to prepare a balancing plan by this December. And of course, in order to balance our budget for fiscal year 22-23, that means acting upon that plan, taking all of those steps to implement the expenditure reductions, hopefully revenue increases, perhaps conversations with the city and the state to try to increase or preserve funding streams. All of that needs to occur within this time frame of this current fiscal year. So we're out on the streets, we're on Zoom, wanting to talk with all of you, engage with you, make sure that you're aware of the challenges that we're facing as a district, as well as gain insights from you about the different solutions that we might implement in order to achieve that balanced budget. So the zero-based budget framework is really a lens that we're looking through at examining our budget. I always want to, I kind of flip this around. If it's a lens, you start up top and it opens out. However you want to look at it, I tend to look at it first at those core services, more like a food pyramid, where what are the critical things that we as a district and county office of education have to provide our students, just as any other district or county office would across the state. However, on top of that, we may have additional priorities that we want to fund. Particularly, we as a district emphasize the equitable allocation of resources. We provide school sites additional staff, for example, to make sure that students who need additional academic or social emotional support have those supports. That's an example of a priority that we have invested in the past. Whereas service enhancements are more like additional staff in central office, let's say business services, which is the division that I oversee, I were to hire additional budget staff or payroll staff or contract staff in order to provide services faster, that's more of a service enhancement, but not necessarily a district priority, unless we were to say we need to serve school sites faster, and then maybe we do bring that closer in to being something that we believe we need to fund. So it's a bit of a sliding scale or a lens. Just it's a way for us to examine the expenses in our budget and determine how much something is a need versus a want. So we are looking at a tight timeline where we've been examining the budget closely, talking internally with staff as well as external stakeholders. But here we are on the verge of entering on October. And as you can see, on this timeline, we're looking to actually present proposals of options. We have the committee of the whole meeting coming up next week, and certainly by November, at the Budget and Business Services Committee, we'll want to have more concrete proposals to put forward. And so we're here this evening to talk about how to put zero-based budgeting into practice, discuss site budgets in particular, and get your input on your perspective on how we would apply that zero-based budgeting lens of what is core, what is a priority, and therefore should be funded if we have the resources to do it, versus a services enhancement. It may be more of a want than a need. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Anne Marie. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan, and good evening, everybody. So I just want to acknowledge quickly that there are a lot of really excellent, complex questions in the chat. And so I was hoping to answer some of them through chat. I think we may be better off making a little bit of time to answer them when we wrap the presentation, but please keep them coming because I think they're really important questions. And so far, I think help a lot with the big picture of our budget as it stands and our forecast moving forward. So I'm going to take a few minutes to talk through kind of a drill down into school resourcing. I think although we have the other questions and we want to make sure that we have open time for discussion, we have some questions for this group this evening to talk more about how we prioritize our investments in service of students and our schools. And so that's really what I'm going to do a little bit of an overview, and then we'll go into discussion from there. So next slide, please. We have a number of different methods of allocating resources to our schools, and some of those methods provide choice and flexibility to schools, to site leaders, school site communities in how funds are used, and some of those methods are prescribed. So on this table, on the left side, site-based budgeting is where there's more autonomy and more choice because allocations are in the form of dollars. On the right side, there is less choice. There is, in some cases, there is choice among different positions or different support services, but these are allocated usually in the form of FTEs or full-time equivalent staff. To support certain initiatives, certain interventions, and are more kind of, I guess, more restricted in that sites don't have flexibility in those supports. Next slide, please. So I think that holding that frame where we want to talk for a minute, we're going to kind of wind our way through some of our school resource some of those different methods. But I think stepping away from that, we have an instructional spending resolution passed by the board last spring that has it establishes a number of policy goals, and one of which is prioritizing classroom spending. Within that, there is, the resolution calls for establishing a baseline for school resourcing. And you can see on the left, there is one baseline that is more focused on the core services, kind of that bottom layer of the pyramid. which is a minimum funding level that schools should expect and that we would guarantee even in challenging financial times. And then on the right side, we have a kind of a bigger picture, kind of the aspirational baseline referred to as the Vision 2025 baseline that you can see includes a lot more detail, many more layers of priorities, service enhancements in how schools might be resourced. Next slide, please. What we want to talk through here is our weighted student formula. So thinking back to the first slide with the two sides of the table, weighted student formula is the single largest method that we use, the single largest vehicle for allocating resources to schools. And it is a funding formula that is that allocates funding on a per pupil basis, based on enrollment and student characteristics that we as SFUSD choose for additional funding for those characteristics. So I know that there's a lot of information on this slide, but there are several steps in the weighted student formula process. And so wanted to just take a minute to walk through those to see how we get to our school site allocations using a weighted student formula. And it starts with a base weight. So right off the bat, when we look at school allocations, all sites receive a base weight per pupil based on their enrollment. And so that is a standard amount. Right now it's around $4,700 per pupil. And it was allocated in the spring based on projected enrollment this school year. From there, we add on equity weights. And so those are the different characteristics of student need that, for example, English learners, you can see down at the bottom, we have a handful of different weights that we use. English learners, special education, socioeconomic status, things of that, different weights. And basically for students, for the different counts of those different students at school sites, additional dollars are allocated. From there, we have our preliminary allocation for a school site. But before we finalize it, we do step 3, which is a baseline check. And that is, we're gonna go through what the baseline is, but basically we want to make sure that the base weights and equity weights together have provided sufficient funding for our agreement of a base level of staffing and funding at a school. If a school does not have enough money to do that baseline, we provide a supplement to make sure that they can. For schools that have beyond the baseline, they retain that allocation, and through budget development, through school planning, we'll be able to make decisions about how the funds will be used. In the spring, we do our preliminary budget process. So this is when principals and school site councils have the flexibility, right? They do receive a dollar allocation, but there's ultimately flexibility to choose how those funds will be used. It may differ from the baseline, right? We know that not all schools have the same strategies. I think some of the idea here is that schools have received their funds based on who their students are, and we want schools to plan around those students. So we don't expect every school's plan to be the same. And then typically in the fall, after we have a firmer sense of enrollment, we do a fall budget revision. And this is meant to help kind of maintain the weighted student formula principle of our dollars following our students. But in the spirit of stability and the desire for minimizing change that could lead to disruption at school sites, we have not done a fall revise process for the past 2 years. So the allocations that sites received in the spring were the allocations they maintained for the full year. Next slide, please. So the baseline, and I think this is something where we have this kind of the weighted student formula baseline listed here, which does or does not need to perfectly match the baseline that we establish in the instructional spending resolution, because we could decide that certain resources will be funded outside of a school's budget, but we want to make sure that that is, right, a guaranteed resource that a school has access to. But for the weighted student formula baseline, you can see here a list of different components. And basically what we do is we make sure that every school has the funding to implement the baseline, but it is not a mandate that a school is staffed according to the baseline. The focus, I would say, is really on the blue center column. Those are the components where we say we want schools, right, to have a principal, an admin partner, teachers, social emotional support staff. So those are the components that were envisioned in this baseline. And then the budget proxy column on the right is how we turn that into a calculation that we can compare against. But really, we recognize that this may or may not be the exact way, right? A social emotional support staff could be a social worker, or it could be something else. Sites, right, there again, there's flexibility. So ultimately, it's a determination of schools and school site councils. But this is kind of the calculation that goes into a baseline check for weighted student formula. Next slide, please. So a lot of information, and we are happy to answer clarifying questions. But as we move from the concept of weighted student formula and recognizing that in addition to weighted student formula, there are other, right, those FTE central allocations that sites receive. We are thinking about what drives our weighted student formula allocations, and how resourcing schools, right, the different impacts, the different levers that affect how we can resource schools. So on the left here, you see we have a fixed pool in weighted student formula that is distributed across all of our schools. The number of schools we have is a lever, right? That's one factor that affects how much money can be allocated to any one school. The number of students in each of those schools is a lever. The size of that baseline, right, is something else we want to consider, and the size of equity-based allocations. So we name this just to recognize that if we establish a really, really robust baseline, it means that we likely won't have very much money remaining to allocate for other characteristics, because we'll spend the majority of what we have ensuring that sites have enough for the baseline. But if we were to allocate everything purely based on enrollment and those weights, we would be in a position where some schools wouldn't be able to afford the baseline. So there's a tension in the way that, right, that basically the resources all are distributed across all of our sites, that we're trying to think about how best to manage and kind of budget towards recognizing our deficit. Next slide, please. Okay, so should we pause for some of the questions first before we go into discussion?
I think so. Or Michelle, you make the call.
Well, I would say it probably depends on what you all, I think there are a lot of really good, important questions that have been coming up in the chat that we'll definitely want to make some time for. And I know that you all are hoping to get some feedback from people who are here. And so do you want to maybe spend a certain amount of time on your discussion questions so that we have a good, at least good 20 minutes or something to answer some of the questions?
Yeah, that sounds like a good deal.
Okay.
Yeah, so do you actually, Anne-Marie, do you mind leading through the questions, and I'll maybe I need to pull up I want to drop the links in as well. So I'll try to do that while you ask the questions and give the context.
Sure. And so I think we'll have to kind of see how best we can, facilitate discussion. But basically we have, right, the series of questions that we wanted to take a few minutes to discuss each, right, to think about, right, the different sides of these questions, different considerations, and then have people at the end register a vote of their preference. And then we would move to number 2, kind of do the same. To be able to have discussion, I think the questions that are here in the slide deck are, they are philosophical and they are challenging. And so we wanted to have a little bit of time for discussion before asking anyone to kind of select a preference. So the first question, and I'll go ahead and I guess I could read it, and then I think I would welcome just if we want to raise hands or have people come off mute to discuss. But the first question is, which approach to baseline school funding, right, in general, is most important across all of our SFUSD sites? And the 2 options are equality and equity. And I don't say that. I think that, I know even trying to write down the questions, it felt uncomfortable, I would say, knowing that we are an equity-minded district and such an equity-oriented district, to say equality is one of the options here. But I think a challenge that we've experienced and something that we hear is also wanting to make sure that every school has certain things. And every school having certain things means that is regardless of the students who are enrolled at that particular site. And so I think that's the tension between those 2, right, where there is equal funding to ensure consistency for every student versus differentiated funding that meets the needs of our most vulnerable students. So it's definitely not an easy one to start with, but I think we welcome feedback, opinions, how people would respond to that question.
There's a comment here in the chat that says, I don't understand why there's a tension. This is a false binary. Thank you for that.
Brandy, would you be willing to share more?
I can briefly, sorry, I'm doing something else right now, but yeah, I don't think we have to center equity. We have legal responsibilities to students with disabilities. I think this is a false binary. When we center equity, all of our students benefit from that. That's all I'm going to say.
Okay, thank you for sharing. And I guess the hope is to kind of spur discussion. I think if anyone doesn't feel comfortable voting, the goal was to be able to kind of spur a conversation and hear, because these are tough questions, and we're trying to figure out how to approach baseline funding. So thank you, Brandy, for sharing. And Meredith, I see your hand is up.
Hey, thanks. So yeah, I mean, I think I'm guessing that most of us would start with centering equity, and I think I'm just curious, what does that mean? Like, what does that mean in terms of, that you're saying, if it, like, what do we lose at a site? Like, are we not going to have a social worker at every site, or what is the alternative? Like, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's a helpful clarification. And I think that what it ultimately means, I think, right, that we're trying to work through what the details, what the actual impacts would be. But I think that the example of a social worker is a great one, where we, if we, ensuring every school has a social worker plays out very differently than one school, being able to allocate two social workers to, you know, certain schools, but it would mean that another school wouldn't have one, right? That's, I think, in thinking of balancing our budget to some degree as a zero-sum game, that if we agree that we are equity minded and want to make sure that our vulnerable students have, you know, have everything that we can afford, then it may mean that other students or other sites are allocated less. That is what it would mean. And we would have to be okay with that.
Anne-Marie, we have one comment in the chat that says equality is easier to implement. Equity opens up the process to opinions and advocacy. And then we have one more hand up from Supervisor Ronan.
Yes, and I saw, I don't know if, is it in the chat, I saw it that it said this is Jennifer, but.
Oh, sorry. I don't know why Jennifer. Hi, everyone. This is Hillary Ronan. I'm the supervisor of District 9, and Jennifer is my legislative aide, and for some reason has my name on her screen. But we are both here. I'm a parent of a kid at Flynn, and both Jennifer and I are going to do everything we can from the Board of Supervisors standpoint to assist the district and to help us get a balanced budget and supplement, et cetera. And so both of us are paying very close attention and trying to understand the budget in the first place. We met with Megan the other day and are looking really forward to working with you all. I just had a question. I really appreciated Meredith's comment, and I'm also just wondering about PTA, the money that PTAs raise in this question and how that comes in, if at all, because some schools raise so much more money than others, and should that play a role? But so much of this is such an uncomfortable conversation because the baseline is so basic and is not nearly enough for the schools. My daughter is at Flynn. She does not have any art or music. She gets PE once every other week. There's only a half-time nurse, and it is a school with a lot of equity needs. And so if that's the baseline, I don't understand how we could go below it. So I don't know if that's what it looks like at other elementary schools. I know Flynn the best, of course, but that question resonated, or Meredith's comment resonated a lot with me.
Yes, I think my initial reaction is yes, that it is like, it is, I would say I'm almost not sure what to say apart from it is complex, and that it is, I think that, specifically with PTA funding, we do see, right, varying levels of PTA support. I think that when it comes to our approach, I guess I would say that it feels like something that we also, even though we recognize the patterns of where sites are able to support, are able to fundraise and, pay for additional staff or things like that, it also doesn't feel as if we from the district stance can, for example, allocate a school less because we think their PTA is going to raise more, right? That is in a sense, right, outside of I would say out of like our approach as a district, because that ultimately isn't something that we can control. So I guess I don't know if Megan has anything else to share. I think that's more my own kind of personal take.
I would just say in response, though, I think it's pretty consistent. Like if you look at Flynn's PTA fundraising, it's almost the same every year, and that's true of most elementary schools. I don't know on the middle school or high school level. I know more of the elementary school level. And that's true of all the schools. And it's like when you go on all the SFUSD tours, it's a selling point. They're like it, and for schools that raise a lot of money. And it's a question that a lot of the parents ask on those tours. So I think it is something that's fairly reliable, and you can look at the history. Anyway, I think it's important if we're really talking about equity to take that into consideration, because there's such a huge difference between schools on that.
Thank you for that, Supervisor Ronan. I do want to actually encourage us to go to the next question, just to kind of round out these different ways of looking at how we manage our funds. And I apologize, I realize I'm having difficulty toggling between the screen share and questions. So here I'll present in a moment, but maybe for this one, I can just read first, just which philosophy to baseline school funding is most important across all SFUSD sites? Would you say that having flexibility where schools have as much freedom to take those weighted student formula dollars and choose how to use those funds, thinking that their school may be more unique or each school is unique and needs different staffing, versus more standardization where that baseline staffing model might be a little bit longer but eat up more of the budget, but then you have common staffing across all sites. So if you go between one school to another, you would see a similar staffing model. I'm curious for some discussion on that one. Note takers.
I'd like to ask a general question. This is Supriya Ray. May I speak?
Yes, please.
Sure.
Okay. I guess I would like to know why, fundamentally, why are you asking for folks' opinions here? What role will folks' opinions play?
That's a great question. Well, we will be talking with the board and getting their opinions, and we are looking just for some community input. I feel like we've had a lot of internal discussions as a district, but I guess it's to have a conversation. For one thing, have folks understand what kind of conversations are happening at the district amongst staff, just weigh these different options and have an opinion about it so that you can help inform your elected representatives, and participate in those discussions about the different types of trade-offs that we're having as a school district. So, I mean, we are trying to have stakeholder engagement so that these conversations can start here and frankly continue for years to come. I think that this is an initial investment in trying to start this discussion and have people feel comfortable with discussing these types of trade-offs and the different levers that we or any other district have to grapple with when we're thinking about how to fund our schools.
There's a hand up from Seth.
Yeah, just to answer your question, and by the way, Supriya, I appreciate your question as well. I do think that flexibility at the site is really important. I think empowering our amazing principals and site leaders and the leadership teams at the sites is really important. There are lots of sort of statutory and legal backstops to sort of require certain kinds of service levels, I think, at many of the schools. So I think that would provide some baselining, but I think that, we could name 10 schools and they have 10 different populations and separate needs and kinds of, tenures of teachers and all sorts of things. So I would err on the side of empowering site leaders, having helped PTO at Glen Park, working with Liz Czar and Gene Robertson. Those folks are amazing, and I think there's probably lots of other amazing principals and site leaders like them, and I would want them to have some more say over what it is that they're able to do with the dollars. So that's just my thought. I also think you should definitely ask the site leadership folks. I'm sure you're doing that, but those folks would have some really good input on this topic, I'm sure.
Definitely. Thank you. Meredith, do you have a comment?
Yeah, just that, wait, let me just see the exact question one more time. Is it flexibility versus standardization? So I don't know if it's exactly answering that, but I agree with Seth on sites having some say, and also if we, as much as we can move towards like an outcome-based funding approach, both at Central and among the sites, tying our spending to student outcomes. I think we would love to, just personal perspective, love to see more about how we're tying our funding to student outcomes.
Thank you. Brandy Markman.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. I have to respectfully disagree with that. I do not think the student outcomes, it would depend what that is and how that's measured. When I hear that, it will a lot of times lead to standardized testing. And really it's proven that our students who basically live in poverty have a harder time with standardized tests. I mean, it's really, if we want to have better student outcomes, we need to redistribute wealth. And so that is also the very common trope in privatization, is we need to look at student outcomes. What we need to do, we need more funding. Like we need more social workers. We need more nurses. We just need more help. So I just want to say, I do not think that's a good metric to look at. Thank you.
Thank you, Brandy. Well, so Anne-Marie and I wanted to have a bit of a discussion before going into, the Mentimeter world. We thought it would be helpful just to have this conversation, clarify what we mean in terms of definitions of, the scales between equality versus equity, flexibility versus standardization. And I know it's not necessarily a perfect split. There can be a whole lot of gray or trade-offs between those different areas. And so with that, we wanted to share this survey and give folks a chance to weigh in and just see generally where people lean in terms of the prioritization between those choices. So the first Mentimeter is for the first question of which approach to baseline school funding is most important across all SFUSD sites. We originally were going to pose the question as at your site, but really this is a district-wide question. So it is important to wear that hat of, just at a district-wide level at that scale, what would make sense? So I ask people to take a stab at filling out that first question.
Megan, are you able to see answers coming in?
I'm trying to get there. Sorry, everybody. This is where I have never used Mentimeter in this format before, and I'm realizing I'm quite clunky at it.
Well, one thing that I can also do, I think, to maybe help with link sharing is that we can put the link to the slide deck for people who are on computers, since the questions are here. Let me do that. Okay. And that's question 2?
Yes. Okay, and it looks like actually it is coming in. So thank you for bearing with me. And I will share. This is actually the second question. It popped up, so I'm going to go ahead and share it. But you can see that so far we've got more leaning towards flexibility. So, so thank you, everybody. I mean, for bearing with my poor use of the Mentimeter tool. I think that it's great to have these conversations just about the different trade-offs and different considerations that we are having to make within our weighted student formula. But I do have an eye on the time. It's getting near the end. We have a little bit less than 10 minutes. So with that, Michelle, I'm happy to hand it back over to you if you want to make your way through some of these original questions.
Sure, we could do that. We've got, there are so many questions and a lot of really good ones. There's no way we're going to get through them. And so, so I just want to make sure that everybody knows that I will save the chat here and make sure we have all of those questions and that Megan and Anne Marie get those. And if there's a way we can create another time to answer. I'm wondering sometimes, if maybe we should just have like an open Q&A time, because we'll often have these presentations that last half the time and then Q&A afterwards, and people have so many questions. So maybe we want to provide another time for that. So I just wanted to mention that. And we'll also have a recording of this we'll share, and the slides we can share. Yep. So I wonder, we're talking about all of these choices, but there were also some early questions that were talking about why we're in this situation, why there is an increase in expenditures. There's been a lot about the deficit that the district is facing next year. There was a question here about all of the federal funds that were given as stimulus funds, and where are those? There were a lot. There's a lot of districts. This was not put in the comment, but there's a lot of news about districts using those funds in different ways than we've been able to use them. And so I wonder if you could kind of cluster a few of those together to talk about why the expenditures will be going up so much next year, and why we're in the deficit situation we're looking at, and about those federal funds.
Sure. So I think maybe to begin, I might address the federal stimulus piece first, that we did receive a sizable amount of federal funding. Approximately 119 million of those funds have a general use that could be applied by districts to cover expenses ranging from reopening costs, testing costs, to additional, all the way down to the operating costs necessary in order to maintain continuity of service for our students. And it's that last line within the long range of options that school districts have for using those federal stimulus funds that we've leaned on as a school district, where we were facing upwards of a $100 million deficit. We were able to use those federal stimulus funds to close the gap. In addition to that, a portion of the federal funds are dedicated to learning recovery or additional supports to help students come back to in-person learning, transitioning. We're using a portion of the funds for ongoing online education for students who aren't ready to return in person. So really, we're putting those funds to full use by addressing our budget deficit in the current fiscal year. So allowing for that as much stability as we can count on by not requiring budget cuts within our operating budget. But then looking ahead to fiscal year 22-23, the reason why it goes up so much is we're in effect, for one thing, just shifting costs back off of the federal stimulus funds and onto the unrestricted general fund, as well as we have our natural growth in the costs of doing business as a district. We account for, some degree of salary increases for staff. However, benefits costs increase substantially each year, particularly for health and pension, and just the ongoing growth of utilities, keeping the lights on type expenses. Those costs are continue to grow at a much faster rate than our revenue outlook. And then, of course, on top of that, we are looking at a decline in our enrollment, which we're hoping that the state will take a statewide approach in looking at the following fiscal year of offering some relief for school districts, that we're not the only district that has lost enrollment and anticipates a decline in our average daily attendance. But should that relief not be provided, we are anticipating a significant decline in our local control funding formula, which is a primary funding source that we receive from the state.
Thank you. And I'll also combine kind of a few different comments that were here early on, asking about possibility of increased school funding at the state level. We've had the stimulus funds, but is it possible that the state would increase just the local control funding formula funds? Is there any possibility of local funds that you're aware of where other revenue might come in to help address at least the immediate deficit?
Can I chime in on that?
I know. Yeah, please.
Sorry, let's tag team, Megan and Anne-Marie. So hi, everybody. Great to see all of you, or hear all of you, or read all of you, what you're contributing here. Just a few things come to mind. I always think state, federal, local, and private. So just a couple of quick things. And I see that there were some chat references to some of these updates as well from Brandy and perhaps others, but there is a lot of discussion happening in DC, including this Build Back Better plan that's being hotly debated right now. And then maybe more importantly, in terms of this budget deficit that we're wrestling with, is the annual appropriations, or the annual budget itself for the U.S. Department of Education in particular. The president has proposed quite significant increases in Title I funding and also IDEA, which funds special education. That's not likely to get resolved for the next few months, but we are hopeful that at some point that some of those proposals might materialize. In terms of other things at the state level that we haven't touched on today or this evening, there are proposals for perhaps providing some safety nets for districts that are like ours, facing decreasing enrollment or decreasing average daily attendance. Megan mentioned those, but there are some specific ideas that are floating around in Sacramento. I think that's probably going to be one of the topics for the budget development process for 22-23, the upcoming cycle. And the first step in that is the governor proposes a budget in January for next year. But in the meantime, there are some legislators that are discussing possible ideas. We're definitely participating in some of those conversations as well. And then locally, I shouldn't say too much at this point because we're running out of time, but definitely working. Thank you, Supervisor Ronan, for your championing the cause for increasing resources for the schools in San Francisco. And if we had more time, we'd love to be able to talk more about some specific ideas, but there are definitely some really clear efforts underway to both seek support from from the city and county, but also from private donations, private donors through the SF Rise initiative and other efforts that are underway. I'm sorry, I'm not being super specific there. We have some things in mind, but we'd probably be better off postponing a deeper discussion about some of those items for another time, or sharing back in a written format or something.
Thanks, Myung. Megan, did you have something to add to that, or did he cover everything?
Well, I might just add a bit on the expenditure side, that particularly when it comes to thinking about advocating at the local level with the city and certainly with philanthropy, the work we're doing to organize our budget through the zero-based budgeting lens is helping us understand what expenses are core and essential and should be funded through standard education funding sources, such as the local control funding formula or federal dollars. But to the extent that we identify priority investments that we can't afford as a district, by organizing our expenditures in that priority-based way, we will be in a better position to articulate why those programs and services need to be funded by the city or by philanthropists. So I do see this body of work as being helpful for advocating for all sorts of funds down the road. And yeah, so I think just simply through that organization, I'm hoping it will help with our advocacy for future funding streams.
Thank you. We are over time. We try to keep these to an hour because we know everybody's time is so precious. Everybody's with their kids at home and staff making the time to be here after a long day. If you all have, I know there are some questions we didn't get to. I have some of my own questions I wanted to bring up, but we don't have time for more, but please put them in the chat and I'll make sure that SFUSD staff see those and see if we can find a way to find more time to get some of these answered. And I'll just express appreciation from the PTA's perspective, one, for staff coming in to listen to parents and to want to, engage us. And this is the third one of these that we've done on kind of related topics, but also to everybody who's showing up and asking these questions, because they're really important. The more you understand about the school district's budget, the more effective advocates you can be for students. So we appreciate you taking the time to be here. I also will throw in a pitch for the Budget and Business Services Committee meeting that is next week, next Wednesday night. Are those starting at 5 now that we're in the new year? Is that, I can't remember, is it 4 or 5?
Budget is 4.
Okay.
But the committee of the whole, it's also going to be focused on budget. That's next Tuesday, okay. And that will start at 5.
All right, so if you all caught that, if you're not on a list to receive notice about those meetings, you can go to the sfusd.edu website and you'll see a link with the board meeting calendar and the committee of the whole meeting where the full board will meet together and discuss. Sounds like the budget will be a topic of discussion on Tuesday starting at 5. And then Wednesday night starting at 4, the Budget and Business Services Committee, where they just do all of this, deeply all the time, every first Wednesday of the month. So that's another place where you can continue to come and make your comments to the members of that committee and to staff. And you can continue to ask questions, of course, as you likely know, board members can't answer your questions directly in committee meetings, but they will hear them. So please come to ask them and consider also just continuing to share information here. And the more themes that we see coming through these chats, then it helps us figure out how we want to focus another one of these meetings that will address the questions that you have. So please continue to put them there. So we'll go ahead and close up for the night, unless you all do you have any final words, Anne-Marie, Megan, or Myung, for folks here? It felt much too short to me. I know we could probably use at least another half hour, but so it goes.
Just thank you for having us. We always appreciate these conversations, and I know it's complex, and we're trying to get better at presenting information in as digestible of a way as possible. So thank you for joining us on that journey.
Yeah, thank you for being here. Yeah, it's always tough to try and share information and then be able to figure out how to discuss it in a short period of time, but we really appreciate everyone for being here.
Yep.
Ditto.
Okay. Thank you all for being here. Thanks everybody who came. Have a good rest of your night, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. And certainly next month, come to these to talk about the student assignment details in the new policy, and then also about how PTAs and school site councils can work together. So watch for dates on those. Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Thank you.